Floyd Allen, a name that echoed through the Appalachian Mountains and spanned generations as a symbol of family loyalty, local political influence, and tragedy. Born on July 22, 1856, in Carroll County, Virginia, United States, Floyd would become the protagonist of one of the most shocking episodes in Virginia's judicial history, but what led an influential and controversial figure in his community to become the center of a shooting that would forever mark the corridors of a courthouse. What happened on that morning of March 14, 1912, changed not only the fate of a family, but profoundly shook the justice system in Southwest Virginia. To understand Floyd Allen's story, it's necessary to delve into the Appalachian Mountains, an isolated region with deep traditions and a strong local identity. In the late 19th and early 20th centuries, that area of Virginia was characterized by rural communities where family ties wielded enormous political and social weight. The formal authority of the courts coexisted with codes of honor and family alliances that influenced disputes and decisions. Local politics were often determined by influential clans, and the balance between tradition and written law was delicate. Carroll County was a geographically isolated territory with small communities interconnected by kinship ties and political alliances. Roads were poor, towns were small, and contact with more developed urban centers was limited. In this setting, families structured networks of mutual support and electoral influence. Loyalty to the family group was a central value, and disputes between clans could span generations. Floyd Allen grew up and lived immersed in this environment, absorbing this culture of family protection and regional autonomy from an early age. The region experienced constant tension between the stricter application of state laws and traditions deeply rooted in local communities. Judicial reforms sought to reduce the direct political influence of families in verdicts and legal proceedings. Many residents saw these changes as external interference in the region's traditional balance. This scenario fueled frequent clashes between influential local figures and representatives of the judicial system, creating an environment of latent instability. Floyd Allen was no stranger to his community. He was a farmer, landowner, and active participant in local county politics. He had a reputation as a determined, combative man, proud of his autonomy. Although he had significant support among allies and relatives, he was also known for past involvements in legal confrontations and physical disputes. His firm stance against judicial decisions frequently put him at odds with authorities. Historical records indicate that Floyd was described as physically imposing and strong-willed. He wasn't simply seen as a criminal by his supporters, but neither was he a universally respected figure. He had already faced accusations related to assault and interference in arrests. His relationship with local authorities was marked by mutual distrust and ongoing political tension. The turn of the century brought greater professionalization to the application of state laws and attempts to limit the influence of family clans over courts and public office. This context intensified the friction between influential figures in the county and the judicial system. Floyd Allen and members of his family became involved in disputes that went beyond personal conflicts and took on an institutional dimension. The Allen family was large and politically connected. Brothers, children, and nephews shared close ties and an active presence in local public life. This family network would play a direct role in the events to come, strengthening internal alliances, but also broadening the scope of the conflict. Tensions between the Allens and the authorities did not arise suddenly. An incident involving assault and interference in the arrest of Floyd's relatives resulted in his conviction and a one-year prison sentence for obstruction of justice. It was during the formal sentencing announcement in the Hillsville court that the situation escalated irreversibly. In a community where political and family disputes were deeply rooted, each conflict left lasting scars. There are records indicating that Floyd Allen declared he would not serve a prison sentence. When the judge confirmed the sentence on that March 14, 1912, what followed would transform that trial into one of the most violent episodes ever recorded in a Virginia court. What occurred in the Carroll County Courthouse was widely reported throughout the country. 5 people died, including Judge Thornton Lemuel Massey, Prosecutor William M. Foster, and Sheriff Lewis F. Webb. Others were injured. The episode became known as the Hillsville Courthouse Massacre and profoundly marked the state's judicial history. The Appalachian Mountains hold many stories, but few have had such immediate national repercussions as this one. The case sparked debates about law enforcement, family responsibility, and capital punishment. Floyd Allen's story has become a permanent part of Virginia's historical memory, symbolizing the clash between regional tradition and formal judicial authority. This is the story of a man immersed in a context of intense family loyalty, local political disputes, and confrontation with the state judicial system. An episode in which unwritten codes of honor tragically collided with the rigorous application of the law. Floyd Allen built his adult life in the same mountains where he was born, in a region where hard work and self-sufficiency were matters of survival. During the 1880s and 1890s, he established himself as a farmer and landowner, consolidating a stable economic position in Carroll County. He married, had children, and expanded the Allen family's presence in the Appalachian region. His property was near the Fancy Gap area, a territory surrounded by mountains where he cultivated his land and raised animals, living a life typical of the rural standards of the time. Floyd's life followed the rhythm of the seasons and the demands of the land. He worked long hours, enduring intense summers and harsh winters. It wasn't a comfortable existence, but it was consistent with regional values. In that community, a man was valued for his ability to support his family and his willingness to defend them. Floyd was seen by his supporters as someone well-established, proud of his independence and loyal to his family ties. The Allens were not the only influential family in Carroll County, but they were among the most numerous and politically connected. Floyd had several siblings, including Sinister Allen, with whom he maintained a close relationship. Sinister shared the same firm vision regarding family autonomy and resistance to what they considered excessive interference from the judicial system. The partnership between the siblings was solid both in business and in local disputes. This union would be decisive in later events. Among his children, Claude Allen stood out for his close relationship with his father. He worked alongside Floyd and absorbed the same principles of loyalty and firmness in the face of conflict. The relationship between father and son was marked by strong identification. Claude accompanied his father in farm activities and also in matters involving the family's reputation, learning early on that the Allen name carried weight in the region. The surrounding community was made up of long-established families, linked by marriages, political alliances, and historical rivalries. Land disputes, past grievances, and electoral competitions shaped local relationships. In such a closed environment, conflicts quickly escalated beyond the personal sphere and took on collective dimensions. Floyd understood these dynamics and acted with strategic caution, but also firmly when he felt his position was being challenged. The county authorities were men who knew the local reality, but who held formal positions representing the state judicial system. This dual identity created constant tension. They belonged to the community, but also had the duty to enforce laws that were not always well received by residents. This scenario made each legal intervention potentially explosive. During the final years of the 19th century, Floyd Allen had a history of minor legal conflicts, mostly related to personal disputes and episodes of aggression. These cases were relatively common in the region and often resulted in fines or settlements. Even so, each lawsuit reinforced Floyd's perception that the judicial system could be used politically against his family. Religion had a strong presence in Appalachia. Baptist and Methodist churches regularly brought families together, emphasizing individual responsibility, morality, and family duty. Floyd participated in religious community life, sharing a practical moral code centered on honor, keeping one's word, and protecting one's own. This code often coexisted with formal law, but was not always aligned with it. Social gatherings and community events served as spaces where alliances were strengthened and disputes could emerge. Floyd was a constant presence in these environments, usually accompanied by relatives. He had a reputation as a firm man who did not seek conflict without reason, but who did not tolerate disrespect. Local politics were intense. Elections for positions like sheriff and prosecutor involved long-standing rivalries and family alliances. Floyd held no formal public office, but wielded influence through his alliances and positions. His political preferences were well known and often aligned with figures who advocated for greater local autonomy. At the beginning of the 20th century, the strengthening of state law enforcement brought noticeable changes to the region. The enforcement of laws against activities considered illegal increased, including practices common in rural areas such as the domestic production of alcoholic beverages. Although this practice was culturally widespread in the region, the stricter enforcement of the law generated tension between residents and authorities. The more active presence of representatives from the state judicial system was viewed with reservation by the local population. Floyd had verbal and legal confrontations with authorities over the years, which deepened his feeling that his family was being targeted by decisions motivated by political rivalries. In 1910, at 54 years old, Floyd was an experienced and influential man in the county. His farm was functional, his children were grown and involved in family affairs. He showed no intention of abandoning his way of life. Nothing indicated at that moment that his trajectory would culminate in an event of national significance. The tensions that would erupt in 1912 began with an incident involving Wesley Edwards, Floyd's nephew, following a fight at a community event. Wesley was charged, and Floyd intervened when authorities attempted to make an arrest. This intervention resulted in formal charges against Floyd for assault and obstruction of justice. Convinced that his nephew was being treated unfairly, Floyd decided to publicly oppose the prosecution. What he saw as a legitimate defense of his family, the judicial system interpreted as a direct affront to the authority of the law. His decision to confront the trial would culminate in a judgment that would go down in history. The Appalachian Mountains shaped Floyd Allen according to values of loyalty, autonomy, and family pride. He did not seek constant confrontation, but neither did he accept what he considered public humiliation. This combination of personal conviction and institutional tension would place him at the center of one of the most dramatic episodes ever recorded in a Virginia court. The year 1911 brought with it events that would profoundly alter the destiny of Floyd Allen and his family. It all began with an incident involving Wesley Edwards, Floyd's nephew. Accused of disturbing the peace after a fight at a community event, local authorities issued an arrest warrant for Wesley, and during the attempted arrest, a confrontation occurred involving Floyd. He interpreted the situation as yet another example of unfair treatment directed at his family. He believed that local political rivalries influenced judicial decisions, and that the Allens were being targeted for persecution motivated by old disputes in the county. Floyd decided to intervene personally. In March 1911, when officers attempted to make an arrest related to the incident, Floyd arrived at the scene accompanied by family members. Testimonies indicate that there was intense tension between the parties. Floyd demanded that the situation be handled with caution and questioned the legitimacy of the action. The atmosphere became tense, with armed men present, although the situation did not degenerate into violence at that moment. For Floyd, it was about protecting a relative. For the officers, his conduct constituted direct interference in the execution of the law. The confrontation ended without shots being fired, but resulted in formal charges against Floyd Allen for assault and obstruction of justice during the attempted arrest. For him, this represented a grave affront. In his view, he had only defended a family member. Now he was formally accused and summoned to appear in court. His indignation was not merely emotional, but rooted in his conviction that the law was being used as a political tool against his family. The charges progressed, and the case was sent to the Carroll County Court in Hillsville. The news spread quickly. Some saw Floyd as someone who had reacted impulsively, but understandably, to a rigid system. Others believed he had overstepped legal boundaries by challenging officers on duty. Regardless of opinions, it was clear that the trial would have significant repercussions in the region. Floyd did not intend to accept the situation passively. He consulted lawyers and began preparing his defense, although he demonstrated little confidence in the impartiality of the local judicial system. He saw the court as influenced by regional political disputes. There were real tensions in the county, and Floyd had political adversaries in important positions, which fueled his distrust. In the months leading up to the trial, the atmosphere in Carroll County grew increasingly tense. Rumors circulated widely. Some claimed Floyd might resist arrest if convicted. Others believed it would all end with a fine or a lenient sentence. Floyd did not publicly fuel speculation of violence, but he also did not hide his dissatisfaction with the ongoing legal process. Sinister Allen, Floyd's brother, shared the outrage. He saw the case as yet another episode of confrontation between authorities and influential families in the region. The brothers discussed possibilities and strategies. Some close friends suggested that Floyd consider leaving the county temporarily if the situation worsened. He rejected this idea, understanding that fleeing would be tantamount to admitting guilt. Claude Allen, Floyd's son, followed the events with growing concern. He deeply respected his father and supported his position, but also feared the consequences of a direct confrontation with the court. There were attempts to persuade him to adopt a more conciliatory stance, perhaps accepting any eventual sentence and ending the episode quickly. Floyd remained firm in his conviction that he had committed no crime that justified severe punishment. The lawyers advised full cooperation with the court. They argued that a less combative stance could result in a reduced sentence. Floyd, however, maintained a public discourse defending his actions as legitimate. For his supporters, it was a sign of courage. For members of the judicial system, it was a sign of open defiance of authority. The judge in charge of the case was Thornton, known for his firmness in applying the law. Massey represented a stance of strengthening judicial authority in the county. He showed no intention of yielding to political or family pressures. For him, the trial of Floyd Allen would be a reaffirmation that the law should prevail regardless of the defendant's local influence. Prosecutor William M. Foster led the prosecution with determination. He gathered witnesses and structured the case, arguing that Floyd had deliberately interfered with law enforcement. Foster knew that some of the jury might sympathize with the Allen family, but he believed the facts would support the accusation. As March 1912 approached, Floyd faced an unavoidable decision: appear in court and accept the verdict, whatever it might be, or escalate the conflict. Friends and family offered various pieces of advice. Floyd decided he would appear at the trial, accompanied by family members, demonstrating that he was not intimidated. The trial was scheduled for March 1912 in the Hillsville courthouse. Expectations extended beyond the local area. Correspondents from regional newspapers showed interest in the case. The trial symbolized more than a simple accusation of assault. It reflected tension between local tradition and formal judicial authority. In the final weeks before the trial, Floyd maintained his routine on the farm. He worked as usual, but those close to him noticed his intense concentration and resolute posture. He regularly checked his weapons, something common in the region, although there is no record of him having declared an explicit intention to commit violence at that time. His presence in court would be seen by him as a defense of his honor and his family. On the morning of the trial, the weather was cold and clear. Floyd woke up early, dressed carefully, and prepared to appear in court. He surveyed his property and the mountains he had known since his youth. He showed no fear. He was determined to face the trial according to his own understanding of dignity and family responsibility, without imagining that that day would go down in history as one of the most tragic in Virginia's justice system. The morning of March 14, 1912, dawned cold in the mountains of Carroll County. Floyd Allen prepared himself with controlled calm, each gesture measured. He would not appear alone in Hillsville. Sinister Allen, his brother, would be present, as would Claude Allen, his son. Other relatives would also be heading to the courthouse, making it clear that the Allens would not face trial in isolation. Floyd donned his best dark suit, adjusted his hat, and, as was common in the region, carried a gun under his jacket, something that, although tense in that context, was not uncommon for mountain men. The road to Hillsville was familiar. Floyd had traveled those roads countless times for business and public engagements. Yet that morning had a different atmosphere. Winter was slowly bidding farewell, and bare trees lined the road under a clear, biting sky. The mountains remained silent, oblivious to what was about to happen. Floyd kept a closed expression, aware that this would not be an ordinary day at the county courthouse. Sinister Allen also went to Hillsville, attentive and vigilant. He shared the distrust regarding the trial and believed that the process had political motivations. Claude accompanied his father, aware of the weight of the situation. The atmosphere among the family members was one of contained tension, but there are no records of them explicitly declaring an intention to confront each other at that moment. Even so, the presence of several armed Allens created an atmosphere of apprehension even before the session began. As they approached Hillsville, it became clear that the trial had attracted unusual attention. Residents of the county and surrounding areas gathered in the streets of the small town. Some sympathized with Floyd, others defended judicial authority, and many were there out of curiosity. The normally quiet town was unusually busy that morning. The Carroll County Courthouse, a red brick building in the center of Hillsville, represented state authority in the region. Floyd entered with a firm posture, accompanied by family members. His presence was immediately noticed. The atmosphere inside was thick with expectation. For Floyd, this trial represented more than a formal accusation. It was a direct test between his vision of justice and the authority of the court. Inside the courtroom, Judge Thornton presided over the proceedings. Known for his firm stance, Massey was determined to conduct the trial according to state law. Prosecutor William M. Foster prepared to plead the charge of assault and interference with arrest related to the incident involving Wesley Edwards. Both were aware of the tension surrounding the case. The jury had already been selected, composed of local men who knew the cultural context of the region. The trial progressed through testimonies and formal arguments. Witnesses described the confrontation that occurred in 1911 during the attempted arrest. The prosecution maintained that Floyd had obstructed the execution of the law. The defense argued that he had acted on impulse to protect a relative. The hours passed under a tense atmosphere. The room was packed with spectators, journalists, and authorities. Sheriff Lewis F. Webb and his deputies positioned themselves strategically, aware of the potential for tension. Webb knew the Allen family well and knew that any move could trigger a reaction. After deliberation, the jury returned a guilty verdict against Floyd Allen. The decisive moment occurred when Judge Massey announced that he would impose a 1-year prison sentence. Historical accounts indicate that it was at this moment that the atmosphere changed drastically. According to witnesses, Floyd declared that he would not be taken to prison. What happened in the following seconds remains a subject of historical debate. There are conflicting accounts of who fired the first shot. The recorded fact is that shots rang out inside the courtroom. Chaos quickly ensued. Judge Thornton was fatally wounded. Prosecutor William M. Foster was also killed. Sheriff Lewis F. Webb lost his life, as did other victims present in the room. The scene transformed the courthouse into an unexpected battlefield. Screams, gunpowder smoke, and people trying to escape created utter chaos. When the shooting stopped, 5 men were dead and several others wounded. The episode would become known as the Hillsville Courthouse Massacre. That cold March morning forever altered the history of Carroll County. The trial, which was supposed to resolve an assault charge, became one of the most violent episodes ever recorded in a Virginia courtroom. The Appalachian Mountains, accustomed to local conflicts, had never witnessed anything of such magnitude within a courtroom. Floyd Allen's trial stretched on for hours that seemed endless. Witness after witness was called, each adding elements to the narrative that prosecutor William M. Foster had crafted to support a conviction. The defense contested every point, questioning the versions presented, and arguing that Floyd had reacted under tense circumstances, not as someone willing to systematically defy the law. As the day progressed, many present perceived that the jury was leaning towards the prosecution. The jurors' expressions revealed increasing seriousness, as if they were convinced that judicial authority needed to be reaffirmed. Throughout the proceedings, Floyd maintained a rigid posture. He showed no obvious fear, but there was visible tension in his expression. Sidna Allen, positioned behind her brother, attentively observed every detail. Claude Allen, near his father, wore a worried expression. Other members of the Allen family, scattered throughout the room, shared the same unease. The atmosphere was one of compressed expectation, as if everyone perceived that this trial carried weight beyond the specific case under analysis. Judge Thornton conducted the proceedings with firmness. He controlled objections, maintained order, and rigorously followed formal procedures. He was determined to apply the law as established by the state. His stance reflected a conviction that the authority of the court should prevail regardless of the defendant's local influence. This position while legally sound, contrasted directly with Floyd's perception of honor and legitimacy. After the closing arguments, the jury retired to deliberate. The silence that filled the courtroom was thick. Floyd remained seated, surrounded by family members, awaiting the outcome. Quiet conversations circulated among spectators and journalists. Floyd kept his gaze fixed ahead, motionless, as if he had already accepted that any result would alter his trajectory. The deliberation was brief. In less than an hour, the jury returned. Silence fell as the judge asked for the verdict. The spokesman stood and declared, "Guilty." Floyd Allen was found guilty of interference with arrest and assault related to the 1911 incident. The reaction was immediate, divided between murmurs and visible tension. Floyd remained motionless for a few seconds, absorbing the decision. Judge Massey then proceeded to deliver the sentence. In a firm voice, he declared that Floyd would serve 1 year in prison. To some, the sentence seemed moderate. For Floyd, any imprisonment represented intolerable dishonor. Witnesses recorded that he stated he would not be imprisoned. The tension, which had been contained until then, intensified dramatically at that moment. What transpired in the following seconds remains shrouded in historical controversy. Accounts differ as to who fired the first shot. The established fact is that weapons were drawn and shots rang out inside the courtroom. Amid the confusion, multiple shots were exchanged between members of the Allen family and authorities present. Sheriff Lewis F. Webb and his deputies moved in to execute the custody order. Amid the commotion, shots struck Judge Thornton, Prosecutor William M. Foster, and Sheriff Webb himself. Other men were also hit. The courtroom, which minutes before had been following legal protocol, was transformed into a scene of absolute chaos. The shooting lasted only a few minutes, but it was devastating. Gunpowder smoke filled the air. People sought shelter behind benches and columns. Deputies returned fire as they tried to contain the situation. The echo of the shots reverberated through the wooden and brick walls of the building. When the shooting stopped, 5 men were dead and several others wounded. The courtroom floor was stained with blood. Survivors emerged stunned, unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of what had just occurred. The episode would become known as the Hillsville Courthouse Massacre, one of the most violent events ever recorded in a Virginia courtroom up to that point. That afternoon in March 1912 forever altered the fate of the Allen family and the history of Carroll County. The trial, which began as an assault case, ended in historic tragedy, deeply marking the judicial memory of the region. The silence that followed the shooting was unsettling, broken only by groans of pain and gasps of breath. Gunpowder smoke hung in the air like a thick fog, partially obscuring the scene of devastation. As people began to move cautiously, the full extent of the tragedy became apparent. 5 men had been fatally wounded during those few minutes of intense violence, and several others carried injuries that would mark them for the rest of their lives. Judge Thornton, who had presided over the trial with firmness and determination, was dead. He was struck during the exchange of gunfire and fell from his elevated position before the courtroom, his judicial robes stained with blood. The image of the fallen magistrate would have an enormous impact when it was reported in newspapers across the country. Massey was 53 years old when he died in that courtroom, leaving family and community deeply shaken. His death represented not only the loss of a man, but a direct attack on the judicial authority of the state. Prosecutor William M. Foster also did not survive his injuries. Foster, who had led the prosecution against Floyd Allen just hours earlier, was found fatally wounded amidst the chaos that engulfed the courtroom. He was 34 years old, a still young man with a promising career ahead of him, now another victim of that brutal confrontation. His death left grieving family members and deprived the county of a rising legal figure. Sheriff Lewis F. Webb, responsible for maintaining order in Carroll County, was also among the dead. Webb knew the Allen family well and had positioned himself to carry out the sentence when the shooting began. He was 57 years old and respected in the region, even by those who occasionally disagreed with his actions. His death symbolized the momentary collapse of local authority within the courtroom itself. Among the fatalities was Augustus C. Fowler, a jury member who had participated in the trial. He was killed during the shooting, becoming one of the most impactful deaths of the episode. The loss of a juror within the courtroom highlighted the gravity of what had occurred. The very mechanism of the legal system had been struck by violence. Betty Ayers, who was in the courtroom as a witness in another trial, was also fatally struck during the shootout. She was shot while trying to seek shelter, becoming a victim of the confusion and widespread panic. Her death further amplified the sense of shock, demonstrating that the violence made no distinction between authorities, jurors, or citizens present. Besides the dead, there were numerous wounded. Congressman J.P. Quessenberry was shot, but survived. Others suffered injuries from gunshots, shrapnel, and falls in a desperate attempt to escape. The courthouse looked like a battle scene. Damaged furniture, broken windows, bullet marks embedded in the walls and wooden floor. In the immediate chaos following the shooting, members of the Allen family who had been involved in the confrontation left the building. Floyd Allen, despite being wounded during the shootout, managed to escape. Sidna Allen also escaped, as did Claude Allen and other relatives involved. The escape was facilitated by the confusion that quickly spread through the small town. Inside the courthouse, survivors began to provide first aid to the wounded. Pieces of clothing were used as makeshift bandages. Desperate attempts were made to stop the bleeding, while messengers ran to find doctors. The small and resource-limited medical community of Hillsville did what it could in the face of the magnitude of the tragedy. News of the shooting spread through the city with astonishing speed. Residents ran through the streets announcing that the judge was dead and that the courthouse had been the scene of a massacre. Panic gripped Hillsville. Stores hurriedly closed, families retreated indoors, and rumors circulated about further clashes. There was uncertainty about how many involved had escaped and whether the violence might continue. State authorities were immediately informed. Telegrams were sent to Richmond reporting the massacre at the Hillsville courthouse. The gravity of the message demanded a swift response. The mobilization to capture those responsible began almost immediately, marking the start of one of the largest manhunt operations ever seen in the region. Meanwhile, Floyd Allen, wounded and hiding in the mountains he had known since his youth, understood that the events had transcended any local dispute. The shooting was no longer just a reaction to the court sentence. It had become a direct confrontation with the authority of the state. Sidna Allen and the others involved also realized the magnitude of what had occurred. They were no longer just men reacting in defense of a family member, but fugitives accused of murder. The consequences would inevitably be severe. Night fell over Hillsville with a suffocating weight. Investigators began the work of documenting the scene, collecting projectiles, recording damage, and attempting to reconstruct the exact sequence of shots fired. Every detail would be crucial in the trials that would follow. In the surrounding mountain communities, reactions were divided. Some saw the Allens as men who had reacted impulsively under extreme stress. Others saw them as responsible for an act of violence that had tarnished the region's reputation. Floyd Allen, hiding in the hills, faced an irreversible reality. 5 men were dead, including 3 public officials. His name would forever be associated with the Hillsville courthouse massacre. The mountains that had witnessed his life now witnessed his downfall, and nothing in Carroll County would ever be the same again. The dawn following the courthouse massacre brought an immediate mobilization of law enforcement in Virginia. Governor William Hodges Mann, alarmed by reports of the shooting, declared that those responsible would be apprehended and brought to justice. He authorized significant statewide reinforcements, increased rewards for information, and coordinated efforts across different counties. The amount offered for Floyd Allen was substantial, reflecting the authorities' determination to bring him to justice. The message conveyed was unequivocal. An attack on a courthouse would not go unanswered. State and local officials converged on Carroll County. Experienced detectives and trackers began scouring the mountainous region in search of the fugitives. Major roads were monitored, train stations observed, and traffic in the area was tightly watched. The Appalachian Mountains, which had so often served as a natural refuge for its inhabitants, were now becoming the scene of one of the largest manhunts ever seen in that part of the state. Floyd Allen, wounded during the shooting, faced significant physical limitations. His injury made long journeys difficult, and seeking formal medical treatment would mean revealing his location. Reports indicate that he initially took refuge on the properties of acquaintances and relatives, moving discreetly at night. However, his physical condition worsened, And those assisting him realized that sheltering such a wanted fugitive placed their own families at considerable risk. Sinister Allen and Claude Allen were also fugitives. The region offered vast, difficult-to-access areas, but the pressure from the authorities was growing daily. The local population was divided. Some sympathizers offered discreet help, providing food or information about police movements. Others, shocked by the violence in court or motivated by the rewards, cooperated with the authorities. Just 3 days after the massacre, on March 17, 1912, Floyd Allen was captured. His location was reported to the authorities, who surrounded the place where he was hiding. Weakened and with no real possibility of escape, Floyd surrendered without significant resistance. The capture was widely reported in the press, which released images of the patriarch in custody, visibly weakened by his injury. Floyd's arrest generated contrasting reactions. For the victims' families and authorities, it represented a decisive step toward accountability. For supporters, it was a stark image of a once influential man now in handcuffs. He was quickly transferred under heavy escort out of Carroll County to avoid riots or attempts at interference. During initial questioning, Floyd maintained a reserved demeanor. He stated that the events in court were the result of circumstances that spiraled out of control, and maintained that he did not accept the version that he had acted with deliberate intent to murder. His narrative differed from many witness accounts, but he stood by his position. While Floyd remained in custody, the search for Claude Allen continued. Demonstrating greater mobility, Claude moved away from Virginia. After weeks of investigation and interstate cooperation, he was located in Des Moines, Iowa, and arrested on April 14, 1912. Like his father, he surrendered without armed confrontation. Sinister Allen proved the most difficult to capture. For months he managed to evade arrest, moving between states and avoiding staying in one place for too long. Wanted posters circulated widely, and the reward offered encouraged tips. As the months passed, life as a fugitive became unsustainable. Constant surveillance and permanent risk limited her options. Finally, on September 14, 1912, Sinister Allen decided to surrender to the authorities in Carroll County, Ohio. The surrender was arranged with security guarantees to avoid public violence during her transport back to Virginia. With Sinister's arrest, virtually all the main individuals involved in the shooting were in custody. The manhunt phase was coming to an end. Now began an even more decisive stage, the formal trials that would determine the fate of each accused. The Allens were kept under heightened security. Authorities sought to prevent both rescue attempts and violent reactions from the public. Floyd, Claude, and Sinister remained separated, awaiting their trials under strict surveillance. The episode that had begun with an assault conviction was now progressing to murder charges that would permanently redefine their lives and the history of Carroll County. The trials of the Allen family members began months after the massacre in the courthouse. Amidst extreme tension and unprecedented national attention, Virginia authorities faced a complex challenge, ensuring the accused received fair trials while also responding to public outcry for accountability after such a violent attack on the judicial system. The decision was made to hold the trials in Withville, a neighboring town in Carroll County, in an attempt to select juries less influenced by the intense divisions that had marked Hillsville. Floyd Allen was the first to be tried, reflecting his central role in the events of March 1912. His trial began in May of that year, under heightened security and extensive press coverage. The courtroom was packed with journalists and observers, and strict security measures were in place to prevent any repeat of the previous violence. Everyone entering the room was searched, and armed officers maintained constant surveillance. The atmosphere was tense but tightly controlled. The charges against Floyd Allen were extensive. He was formally charged with first-degree murder in the death of Judge Thornton Lemuel, in addition to charges related to the deaths of Prosecutor William M. Foster and Sheriff Lewis F. Webb. The prosecution presented a detailed case, supported by numerous witness testimonies from those who were present in court during the shooting. Many still showed visible emotional distress as they recounted the events. Witnesses testified that they saw Floyd armed at the time of sentencing, and several reported that he actively participated in the shooting. The prosecution argued that the Allens had come to court prepared to react if the verdict was unfavorable, The narrative presented maintained that the attack represented a direct challenge to judicial authority. The defense faced enormous difficulty. The lawyer argued that Floyd had reacted amidst the chaos, and that there was no conclusive proof that he had fired the first shot. The strategy sought to introduce reasonable doubt and exploit conflicting accounts of who initiated the shooting. Character witnesses were also presented, describing Floyd as an influential and respected man in the community. Nevertheless, the circumstantial and testimonial evidence weighed heavily against him. The multiple victims and the context of the shooting made the claim of self-defense difficult to sustain. The impact of the deaths within a courtroom inevitably influenced the jury's perception. Floyd decided to testify in his own defense, attracting considerable public attention. He stated that he believed his life was in danger at the time of sentencing and that he reacted to what he perceived as an imminent threat. Under rigorous cross-examination, his answers were frequently challenged by the prosecution, which sought inconsistencies and contradictions. After hours of deliberation, the jury returned with the verdict, guilty of first-degree murder. The recommendation was the death penalty. Floyd received the decision without visible emotion, maintaining a rigid posture while the sentence was recorded. Days later, the sentence was formally pronounced. Floyd Allen was sentenced to death in the electric chair, the method adopted by Virginia at that time. The judge declared that the crime represented a serious attack on public order and judicial authority. Floyd would await execution while his lawyers prepared appeals. Sinister Allen was later tried on similar charges. Witnesses placed him armed during the shooting, but his involvement was deemed minor compared to Floyd's. The defense emphasized that Sinister acted amidst the chaos and under strong family influence. The jury found Sinister guilty, but recommended a prison sentence instead of the death penalty. He was sentenced to 35 years in prison. The sentence reflected an understanding that, although an active participant, he had not been identified as the main person responsible. Claude Allen, Floyd's son, was tried in a separate trial. His youth was mentioned by the defense, but testimonies also placed his active involvement in the shooting. The prosecution maintained that his participation was decisive. The jury convicted Claude Allen of first-degree murder and recommended the death penalty. Like his father, he was sentenced to execution in the electric chair. The decision shocked some of the public due to his age. Other members of the Allen family faced trials and received varying sentences depending on their degree of involvement. Authorities sought to hold all direct participants in the massacre accountable. The trials represented one of Virginia's most extensive judicial efforts to date. Numerous hearings, testimonies, and appeals were meticulously documented. The state sought to demonstrate that due process would be strictly followed. Following the convictions, appeals were filed in higher state courts and taken all the way to the United States Supreme Court. None of them resulted in the reversal of the death sentences. In March 1913, Floyd Allen and Claude Allen were executed at the Virginia State Penitentiary. With the executions and the serving of prison sentences, the most dramatic judicial chapter in the history of Carroll County came to a close, although the historical debate about responsibility and cultural context continued for decades. The years following the trials were marked by a series of appeals and legal disputes that kept the Allen case in the public consciousness. Floyd Allen and Claude Allen, both sentenced to death, became the focus of intense legal efforts to try to overturn their sentences. Lawyers filed appeals at different levels, arguing possible procedural irregularities, questioning the impartiality of the juries, and maintaining that the climate of strong public outcry may have influenced the verdicts. Each appeal prolonged the wait for both the convicted and those awaiting the final outcome. Floyd Allen, confined on death row, spent his days in solitary confinement at the Virginia State Penitentiary. Accounts from the time describe a man more silent and introspective than the combative patriarch known in the Appalachian Mountains. Although he maintained that he had not been treated fairly, there are records of him expressing regret for the deaths that had occurred. He exchanged letters with family members, reflections that revealed resignation in the face of impending execution. Claude Allen, young and also condemned to death, faced his own grim reality. He was just over 20 years old when he awaited execution. Letters attributed to Claude demonstrate regret and anguish over the events that had transformed his life. His youth generated public debate, but legally his sentence remained firm. The appeals went up through the Virginia judicial system and reached the United States Supreme Court, which refused to interfere in state decisions. The convictions were not overturned. With all appeals exhausted, the only remaining possibility was executive clemency granted by the governor of Virginia. Public campaigns urged Governor William Hodges Mann to